kids, right? Yeah. Tina can babysit. I can? You're a little old.
It's working. All right, so hello everyone. I'm gonna go through building a jar this evening. I can't tell if this. Hopefully, this is working. This isn't really my thing, so we'll hope for the best with it. So I'm gonna do some coil building for some jars tonight. This is one I started last week or so, just out of coils. Top comes off like this. There's a gallery down in here built into it like this, so I'll talk a little bit about that. That this can just rest into, and then there's this little house on top for the knob. So I'm going to put this one to the side. And go ahead and get started. Move the camera down a little bit. These few things. Okay, so there we go. We had a moment there. So I'm going to go ahead and get this started. I just got a handful of clay that I'm going to kind of squeeze out, pinch out, try and make this into a flat bottom that I can then start building off of. So I'm just going to kind of pinch this out kind of flat. So about the diameter I want, which is going to kind of be dictated from what I have. And then I'm just going to grab a rolling pin to flatten this out a little bit, even it out before I start building on it. So generally I'm kind of looking for this to have a similar thickness to what I want the rest of it to have, maybe a little bit thicker. And then I'm just going to go ahead and compress this real quick. Obviously, to make this stronger, make it not want to crack. And then just get rid of any of that texture that was left on it by stretching it. Just keep smoothing that. And then I'm going to go ahead and, for this, I'm just going to kind of build this in the round. So I'm just going to get sort of a round section going. And then just kind of flatten down that edge that's created by the cutting. I'm going to take one of these serrated ribs just to score this fairly heavily before I connect the first coil onto it. And then I'm going to start rolling out a couple of coils. I'll just move this for a second. And so for rolling out coils, I'm not too overly concerned about the real length that I'm creating, size of them. I'm just trying to get something somewhat consistent. And then I'm just going to apply this and just pinch down, really try and force this into the slab. Of all the coils that I put on, this is always going to be the one that I try and really put the most effort into to really make sure that it really sticks down on there. So again, I'm going to take that scoring rib again and score that first coil down onto the slab really heavily. Like so. And then come back in with a rib and just smooth all that out. Like so. And then for the moment, I'm going to leave what's happening on the outside. I'm not as worried about that connection. I can always clean that connection up later. It's mostly worrying about the connection that's happening on the inside, thinking about this ending up someday, finished out and being utilitarian, holding something, making sure that this inside of the bottom doesn't crack is really important. And so I'm just going to start putting one end of my new coil on, and then again, just sort of pinching that on. So I'm really pushing this in on the inside so I get a really strong connection. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to try and make about 3 layers of coils here before I go on to the next, before I go on and start compressing things. What I want to make sure of is that everything's together nice and tight. And a lot of that is what's coming from having this clay body. This is one that I just mix up myself. Essentially, it's just a kind of a generic light stoneware. The real perk of it, especially for hand building purposes of it, is there's about 15% grog in it. Sometimes I use sand, but mostly I just use really fine grog. I really like that for hand building, particular coil building, because I can work rather quickly, but the clay is rather strong because of that grog addition. And I can also just sort of pinch this together, squeeze this together. And I don't have to worry about slipping and scoring. I think sometimes one of the downsides of coil building can be a lot of times people want to put slip in between their coils, do a lot of scoring. But all slip's really going to do is, it's going to help it adhere maybe a little bit, but it's just going to rehydrate everything. So you really want to be careful not to hydrate your coils, because once you start adding a bunch of water to it, then all of a sudden you're just going to have to wait for it to dry. And once you have to wait for it to dry, you have to wait for it not to want to slump and things like that. Whereas if I can build this faster without any moisture, this whole sort of thing just kind of evolves a little bit more seamlessly, a little bit more easy. A lot of times I've built these out of porcelain, and porcelain gets really weak just because it's from its natural ability to be sort of thixotropic. Even if it has sand or grog in it, it still gets that sort of gelatinous sort of feel to it. Once you start trying to coil build it, and the next thing you know, the whole thing just kind of shakes down or wants to slump on you. So for me, with building these, it makes a lot more sense to try and make these out of stoneware, kind of a lighter clay color, and then I can go back in with a white slip or a porcelain slip, and that'll help if I'm worried about glaze color or something like that. So I just went ahead and smoothed out, compressed those coils on the inside and the outside. Try and do most of it with a rib as I can. It takes a little bit of extra burden off of my hands. Sometimes if I just use my fingers to compress everything, they tend to hurt a little bit. And, that's a bad thing. Like I said, I spin around about 3 times. Um, don't really worry too much about the actual coil length each time. It can go all the way around, once around, 3 times around. It's just more about trying to get to that general height that I'm looking for with each layer. Which this one's going to come up just a little bit short. So I'm going to have to add another one. And sometimes in the past, I've tried to go ahead and make a bunch of coils ahead of time. And that can be really nice for working really large, or maybe working on like 3 or 4 things at once. So you just kind of extrude a big pile of coils and start working on them. But for this scale, and maybe just working on one of these at once, just being able to sit down and kind of roll out each coil as I need it, I find to be a little bit more, maybe cathartic, maybe just more interesting, maybe slows things down a hair. So all I'm worried about at this point is, generalizing the form. Smoothing things out or compressing things is my biggest interest. I guess everything's not necessarily smooth. There's still some lumps and crevices and things like that. But I'm not really worried about that at this point. That's all going to get dealt with later as it gets a little bit stiffer. Maybe I'll leave this sort of surface. Maybe I'll add more surface to it. All that kind of happens, once the whole form's there. Some of those answers are a little bit easier to make sense of. So those of you, I don't know who's watching this, I don't know how to work this to see. But if you don't know me, who I am, I don't really interact with this group a whole lot. I don't get on the Facebook very much. Every now and then I just tend to check in. It mostly is a lot of things that I try not to worry about. But I noticed that this group was doing this thing, and I thought that sounded like a good time. I'm one of the people, not able. I guess everyone was not able to go to Ensika this year, so that was a real bummer, I think, for everyone. I know I always enjoy it. I always have a good time. But I was also going with, I had 13 students going with me, and one of my coworkers. So I teach at Morehead State University. It's in Morehead, Kentucky. It's in the eastern part of the state. If you're not familiar with Morehead, I would imagine most people probably aren't. But if you're familiar at all with that part of Kentucky, it's about an hour east of Lexington, which makes it about an hour west of West Virginia. So I live here, teach here. This is my 4th year at the university. Prior to being here in Morehead, I spent, we usually round up to 10 years, but I think in reality, if I sat down and did the math, it might be like 7 or 8 years, maybe 9 years down at the Moraine Art Center in St. Petersburg, Florida. And then, of course, before that, it was St. Petersburg Clay. But that's a whole different story. But I know, Matt Sheeman was on here doing one of these demos the other day. Was able to catch the tail end of that. And so is where I'm assuming he talked about a bit, or at least mentioned. So it was that place. And then before that, I did my graduate work at the University of Mississippi in Oxford, Mississippi. Most people know it as Ole Miss. Matt Long teaches there. Rondale did before I got there. And then prior to that, I had gone to Miami University of Ohio. That was actually in Oxford, Ohio as well. Studied under Dennis Tobin. And that's probably where I learned most of how I learned how to coil build like this. So at this point, it's going to just look like a bunch of repetitive motions until we can start putting some shape into this. I think I'm going to lower this down a little bit so it's a little bit easier to work on. So typically, again, if you're not too familiar with who I am or the work that I make, this is going to end up, most likely being wood-fired or soda-fired. Where I teach, we have a downdraft soda kiln and a kind of a barrel-arched cross-draft wood kiln that would fire in one of those, most likely the wood kiln. I don't do as much soda firing as I used to. I tend to lose a lot of color if I do that. Whereas with the wood kiln that we have, it's a pretty short firing. We only fire for about 24 hours. Yeah, about 24 hours. We can kind of stretch it out, shorten it even less if we want to. But for me, it works really well because it being a shorter firing, we still get that nice ash accumulation and nice flashing, but it can be pretty easy on some of those really bright colorants, things like in the velvet underglazes, reds and oranges. Yellow's still a little bit tricky, but a lot of the reds can still pop pretty well. And so I'm imagining it'll end up in there somewhere with some sort of decoration on the outside. That previous piece that I was showing was kind of based on a silo shape, and it had kind of a patterning on the outside, somewhat reminiscent of maybe the metal paneling you would see on the side of a silo, and then glazes or underglazes or slips that would get used with that on the surface. I might think about colors, in particular ones as I see. If you're not familiar with Eastern Kentucky, and I never knew it until I moved here, there's a pretty big tradition, I guess you would call it, or kind of a community effort for people with barns to put big quilts, on the side of them, out of wood, not real quilts, but more just kind of using that patterning. And so I really like that. Some of them look like they were about 4 foot by 4 foot, maybe 6 foot by 6 foot or bigger. A lot of times you can see them from like way off in the distance on the side of the road. And I really like that. I'm assuming, I don't really know much about it, but I'm assuming, there's a big lineage of quilting around here. It's not anything I know about, but this idea of putting them on the side of barns is really fascinating. As a means of, it's weird because it almost like it doesn't decorate the barn because it's still a barn. It still kind of looks like it already looks. And a lot of times it's on fairly run-down barns. But it just really sort of almost like ties it all together, kind of makes everything get a little bit of sense going. And you see a variation on it. Sometimes it'll be like a really brand new barn, but it'll have this really old quilt square, or it'll be a really old barn with a brand new quilt square, and it's just like this great pop of color on this really old, rundown wood. They're all a bit different. I guess I don't know if the patterning comes from different family things, almost like a crest, or if it's just one that someone came up with. But it just really makes the landscape interesting in a way I never would have really imagined. If you told me before I saw them that putting quilts on the side of a barn was a good idea, I might call you crazy. But I guess that's how most things go. They always sound worse than they are. Well, maybe not always. Sometimes they are just bad. Let's see if we can start bringing this in a little bit. So right now this is fairly cylindrical. Again, I'm not too overly concerned about the shape. I just kind of need to get this sort of a cylinder shape up to a height that I feel good about, and then I can start shaping it a little bit more. but try and bring in the top a little bit. I mean, it's like anything, even like throwing on the wheel. Like, oh, once it starts going out and you want it to go in, it's harder to do. So if I can bring it in now, it's going to be easier to deal with later. So hopefully, I guess I could mention, the elephant in the room. Hope everyone's doing well, feeling well with the whole coronavirus. Hopefully, it's all going to work out. Hopefully, everyone feels well. Hopefully, everyone's in a location where they're safe or have resources available. We went to the K. Roger this afternoon, and there was actually toilet paper in the aisle for the first time we haven't been in about a week, but there wasn't any that day. So I would imagine it's all gone by now. But bought ourselves a bonus pack just to be safe. But yeah, so it's a weird kind of thing happening right now. And so it's kind of nice that these videos have been put on. Kind of maybe help distract people. For people in quarantine, self-quarantining, just kind of don't want to go outside. I know I shared with my students that this was happening, that they could join the group and watch videos of people making things, because right now they don't have access to anything unless they have it on their own, which I don't think many of them do or any of them do. Which is going to make the rest of the semester really difficult because we had just left for spring break and we were told we were going to be closed or online for 2 weeks, and then come back and everything would be normal. But in the spring break, they told us it was just the rest of the semester was going to be online, and so that's weird. Right? Studio class online doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially ceramics when people need kilns, clay, things like that. But they were gone when they decided to just go the rest of the semester online. So we couldn't even, I know some people and friends who were able to provide tool packs or clay packs. It's just kind of a mess trying to get people. I know some people came back to campus if they lived in a dorm, but it was just like, the last thing I wanted to worry about was coming by to get a bunch of clay and then, maybe being able to work on clay at their dining room table. I'm in the basement of our house, so it's a little bit separate from the living space, but I don't love the idea of working on clay, in the house. So I don't want to seem like I'm forcing them to do that. If they maybe don't feel it's a safe environment or a healthy environment for that, especially right now. The corona and lung things that it does, I don't know if ceramics helps that, if they're doing that in a a small living space, especially if they don't have the college students don't always have the wherewithal to clean up after themselves very well. So I worry about that. So I told them not to take any. But they could if they wanted to. But like I said, most of them were gone. So at this point, I'm going to start trying to balloon this out a little bit. Let's see if we get a little bit more. There we go. So obviously it's hard to do much with the bottom down here, but try and get this section to come out a little bit more. And really, it's just going to be me pushing out from the inside. Again, with a rib, and try and use a curve to create a curve. But back to the, elephants, we're really lucky that so many programs are kind of stepping up and helping. Ceramics Material Workshop, hopefully everyone's familiar with that. My students were able to register for a course they put with that, so I'm going to be able to use that as a teaching tool for my intermediate through a graduate student class. And so that'll be really nice. Even though we can't practically use those things, it's still going to be interesting. and a little bit ceramics. All the other ideas I've had are just like, well, let's just draw pots, and it's just like, well, it's a drawing class, so is that really even relevant? Kind of is, but so again, to try and make this top a little bit more bald, this bottom a little more narrow, as I'm pushing from the inside, I'm going to be pushing down here with my left hand, pushing in, or more supporting in, so that I don't spread that out, and so I can really get that nice curve out. Kind of interesting doing this and watching it through a camera lens or a computer screen. Usually I have to kind of step back, look at things, but now I can just kind of look over. But it's not really the same spot I'm looking at, so that's kind of weird. So see how kind of round we can get this. So this is one of those points earlier I was talking about. I tried when I attach these coils, I'm just pinching them on and compressing them on. I'm not adding any slip or any water or any vine guard. I'm just trying to minimize that water content in the clay. I like my clay pretty soft, so it doesn't need a whole lot added to it. But if I'd added slip to all my coils at this point, it'd be really challenging to do this and not have it want to collapse. So I'm just trying to make this really rounded. And let's just kind of make this one big flare. There we go. The bottom was a little bit too straight and disconnected. So sometimes as I'll go, if these were larger, I might have to stop and use a torch or something like that. But this is kind of a nice tabletop size, and usually can go pretty well in one sitting. The camera shakes quite a bit when I roll this. It's kind of nauseating looking. Again, when I put these coils on, I'm really trying to make an effort. I'm kind of rolling my thumb into my fingers so that the inside is really getting connected. The outside's not as connected, but that's okay. Sometimes I'll leave coils on the outside as like a decorative motif. But not this time. Maybe towards the top. So when I compress these on the outside, I always make sure that my hand's on the inside. A lot of these techniques or ideas of how to approach this aren't too different from throwing on the wheel. I'm not gonna try and focus on one spot for too long. I'm gonna try and make sure that if I'm pushing on the outside, I have support on the inside, and vice versa. I don't want to try and make this collapse unless I want to. So the one annoying thing about this is as I get closer to the top, it's going to get more difficult to try and compress the inside. So sometimes, especially after this last round that I did, I'll probably have to make sure that I go ahead and do less coils around. So there's always this point once you put those coils on, this shape's going to look terrible for a moment. maybe a few moments, trying to get everything compressed, all this poking and prodding from the inside, before I can go back and kind of redefine this a little bit more. So this will be a little bit different of a shape from that, more silo shaped one that I showed earlier. Now we're like halfway through. You can probably even get the lid off still. This is where time was getting a little weird. That's a little weird spot. There we go. Mm-hmm. So I can go a little bit more upright. So let's presto change onto a lower wheel. There we go. All right. How's this look? That's looking okay. The bottom's a little weird. I think we can deal with that. Let's use a little torch. All right, so of course I was using that torch just to speed up that drying down there. It's weird seeing two sides at once because of the camera. It's kind of interesting. I guess it's like how people throw with mirrors. Never understood that though. So at this point, I'm just trying to narrow this in at the top so I can get a lid out of it. So I'm basically just trying to coil this all the way in, kind of making a little dome. And then I'm just gonna pinch a little cake for the top, smooth this in. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and score this first. Just make sure it's nice and strong. Yeah, there's been a lot of good content out there throughout the days on here on the Instagram. It's been really nice. Shame I've had to try and figure out how to teach ceramics online. I haven't been able to enjoy all of it. The sun came out today, so that was nice. So at this point, with this domed over on the top, this becomes a real point of wanting to crack. Just have to make sure that I'm careful of that. So at this point, I can go ahead and define some of this a little better. It's almost gonna be like an old ginger jar type of thing. So even though I have this line here, this lid's probably just going to be this top section. This is more just kind of break up shoulder and neck. So let's see what we can find. So I'm going to start just very lightly just pressing in a line. Give an idea of where my lid's going to be, what part of this is going to be the lid. And I can kind of think about approaching this a few different ways. If I wanted to, I could have some notches like that on a couple spots, kind of make this sort of like a locking sort of thing. But I don't think I'm going to do that. I think I'm just going to add a little bit of Galleria on the inside. So I'm going to grab a little knife thing and then just cut this. So one thing that I always prefer to do before I cut, that I forgot to do this time until I started talking about it, is so this isn't, if I had wheel thrown this, there'd probably a lot more symmetry happening here. But this is, especially the top, the sides, everything's very asymmetrical to a slight degree. So I want to make sure that I leave myself some registration marks and just those little 2 dots, so that as I'm building out this next part of it, I know that it's going to fit, so that I put it into the right spot. Because I made that mistake otherwise. So there's some for this side. 2 should be enough. So I'll take that off. And so a good thing I have to worry about now is all those coils that I couldn't get to before. I need to smooth those out. And before I start smoothing those out, I'm just going to use one of these little scoring things. And this is still really soft, so I'm making sure that I really cup this in my hand so that I don't warp it too much or alter it too much. So again, just scored up really nice. And again, without adding any further moisture content, I'm just going to smooth this, compress it really well, keep it really snug in my palm so it doesn't crack, doesn't warp. This one a little more rounded. All right, so now that looks better. There's still some imperfections in there, but that's just because the clay is so wet. So, and that's going to sit on there eventually. I'm just going to put this off to the side, a little piece of foam. Inside of this needs some cleanup. I'm just going to use my finger to compress this last little bit of coil. And again, I'm trying to really make sure that as I'm ribbing on the inside, that I'm coddling the outside so it doesn't stretch out. So again, that's going to sit there. So I can kind of come up with a couple of different solutions of how to deal with this. Essentially I can build a little gallery, cut gallery down into here so this sinks in there a little bit more, or I can raise the walls from the outside with a coil. Or I could put a flange inside of here if I didn't want it to rock around from that way. But I think usually a little bit of gallery up on the outside is my favorite way to go. Which means, just to be safe, I'm going to lower these registration marks because I'm going to put a coil right here. I want to make sure that that doesn't get covered up. So again, I'm going to come back and score the outside of this. And then, before I do that, I'm going to grab a moist sponge and just soften this lip real quick from where I cut, because this is going to be a little bit harder to clean up after I have attached the gallery to it. There we go. Now I'm going to pinch this. And again, depending on how many, can I put this on? There we go. So, right now this is one coil deep for the gallery. If I want this to go deeper, which I do, I'm going to add another coil to get a little bit more height. So now I'm going to come in and clean up the inside of this. So this might have gotten too tall, which is kind of nice. You can always cut back too tall. And so sometimes with the outside of this, I might leave those coils. Since coils are compressed everywhere else, this could be a good spot to try and leave those. And I do kind of like that. Maybe I'll leave that for the time being. See how it feels when we get the lid back on there. So the tricky part with hand building lids is getting them to fit really well. And kind of trying to decide for yourself what that means. Is a little bit of jiggle okay? No jiggle? Lots of jiggle? These are all just decisions for ourselves. I'm just trying to even this out a little bit. So where's my single dot? That's a double dot. Oh, right. So before I fit this in there a little bit more, I'm going to put the old cornstarch down. So it doesn't stick. If you're unfamiliar with the cornstarch, it just kind of, I guess it just dries out that top layer so that nothing wants to stick. And so you can see down in there now. It's a little bit bigger than it needs to be. That's okay, because we can sort of start squeezing things in, which is nice. We got a nice kind of little bit of bump out the top. So just gonna press this in ever so gently. There we go. So again, I'm not totally convinced about these coils exposed. I like it more seeing it on the screen than actually seeing it in person, which is kind of weird. Let's smooth this connection down a little bit. And so if I was, building this top part onto a leather hard surface, then I might try and definitely want to compress and score these fresher coils into the older coils. But again, this is all the same consistency still. So it really just pitches together really easily. If you missed me say it earlier, this is this clay that I make up. Basic stoneware, not too dark. But it has about 15% fine grog in it, maybe a little bit of medium grog sometimes. And so that grog just makes it really easy to just pinch together. So I don't have to worry about adding any moisture content. So now the next big question, is where does this top go? Where does, what kind of knob do we put on here? Is always the hard part. There's a flat spot in here that's kind of bothering me. What kind of knob's going to go on here to help kind of tie this whole thing together, kind of like a nice rug. I think my hand's just a little bit too small. We're going to lose some here. That's all right. Here we go. If anyone saw that jar earlier, that had a house on it. Sometimes unicorns happen on things, or uniwhales. Those haven't happened in a while. Ripped a little bit of gallery on that accent. So maybe we'll put a unicorn on something. I haven't done that in a while. I guess it is Thursday. So I'm just pinching in a new spot before I rip the gallery out. But the shape on the outside looks better. You might not be able to see it, but I can see it. There we go. So now we need a new cornstarch application. Ooh. I'm just going to soften this edge a little bit. Some of this edge crispness I'm going to be able to clean up more after it dries. I'm just going to soften it right now. So we can drop this back down. Got some markers over here, some markers over there. So right now these what are they called? I just had it in my head. Registration marks where these lids are going to go, where the lid sits. Most likely those are going to stay for right now through the firing process. The way it's glazed or slipped or underglazed, there might be some sort of broken up surface. That'll help kind of show where the lid is. But right now I really need those registration marks. So we've got some front legs, some back legs. One of them just fell. I think these look more like back legs at the moment. You can think about the way that's going to go. I'm just going to take a little coil for an interior piece. Again, at this point, I'm just going to really just pinch these together. I can do this without my hand in the way. There we go. So I'll kind of make this part separate and then attach it at the last moment. So we need a head. Just pinch that on there. Oop, can't see that. And then you just start pinching out some of those facial features. Like so. And then so I'm gonna, where's my needle tool? A little bit of scoring on one side, a little bit of moisture, gets an eyeball. Might be a little bit too big. So it'll come down a little bit. That's a better size. So we get an eye on one side, and then I'm going to leave a nice little eye socket, kind of a crevice on the other side. So one-eyed unicorn kind of makes a little bit more sense. And they have a tendency to make unicorns with one eye. That's too big. And that started, I don't know when it started, but I know why it started. There was a sculpture professor at Ole Miss, well there is, he's still there, Durant, and we would go out to his house sometimes out in the middle of kind of nowhere. And the main directional key when you got really close to his house was that you turned by the one-eyed donkey. I always like that. You don't have interesting directions anymore. Because you got the Google boxes and the iPhones just do it all for you. And so I like that kind of a little reminiscent of that time, a different time when we all had to, think about directions a different way. got directions from a student of mine here who's more of a non-traditional student, Army vet, and he was giving me directions somewhere. And written out was this, go by a church that looks new. And it looks new because it is new, because here's what happened to the old church. All in, a set of directions. It's like the MapQuest isn't going to tell you about if it's actually a new church or not. So it's kind of fun to think about that. That's one of those kind of things you just kind of concede that no one's going to ever know about. You just think that you don't know how to make two eyes on a unicorn. That's just life in the big city. So I'm going to score this back section for its mane. And then tails get this little bumpy plug. Now score that as well. And then now basically it's going to make a bunch of little pieces of coil. That's too thick. And then just start building it on here. And I'm going to go ahead and there needs to be an extra little base on here before the unicorn sits on the lid like this. It looks kind of awkward. So before I attach this on, I'm going to put something on there. Probably like a little ball or something. Like when you used to see animals at the circus bouncing on balls. Saw something recently. I'm assuming it wasn't a figment of imagination, but it was where some circus company was starting to use holograms for animals. It's like, how crazy is that? Kind of makes sense. Everything's a liability these days. All right. Unicorn tail. So I'm just going to come up the backside. I wonder if unicorns still have manes, or if that's reserved for horses. I bet there's people with a lot of opinions about that. You see that? There we go. It's like Bronchonius or Bobcephalus. Chariot. Sun pony. Probably Bobcephala though. Oh, that says 59 minutes. 41 seconds. So it might be about go time. Oh, let's just collapse this whole side. So look at, so I could either attach that just like that, but I think I'm going to put a little bit more on here. And this going a little bit late, or than it was supposed to. But I'm pretty sure I was the last person, so hopefully if I'm wrong, someone can kick me off. And then I'm just going to pinch a little ball. in on itself. And then again, score this really well. Press that seamage. And roll it around to round it up a little bit more. And then now we're kind of getting into those important connection points. So I'm going to do a little dab of water on both of these. And then pull this out really quick, actually. And really kind of squeeze this on here. And again, this is still pretty soft, so I can just kind of compress this in here to really try and push that clay up inside there. So sometimes with these is when they have unicorns or something of the like on the top, especially on top of a ball or something like this, this on here, and then trying to kind of glaze and slip or underglaze inside of all these nooks and crannies can be kind of difficult. So sometimes what I like to do is just leave this on here, dry it on there, biscuit on there, and then once it comes time for glazing, I would just dump this in a really fluid glaze and just sit that on top of there and let that glaze just make that connection happen. Which I think is what I'm going to do, because a lot of times these little pause sort of things have such a small amount of connection that it gets really difficult to get in all the nooks and crannies. So this is where we ended up. Nice little unicorn jar. Give it a little bit of a spin. Dun, 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 dun. And so again, if you want to see that gallery one last time, there's the Galleria and the innards. And of course, I'll just let this, I'll cover this, but I want to make sure that the lid dries in place, shrinkage. It's like being in the pool. All right, thanks for coming out tonight. Assuming someone watched this, I don't really know. This doesn't really tell me anything, or I don't know how to do it. But yeah, hopefully I had a good time. And I will see you all later, I guess.